Welcome to E-commerce with Coffee, a podcast powered by Amber Engine, where we share e-com secrets for brands over your favorite brew. We start with the caffeine and then leap enthusiastically into behind-the-scenes e-com insights that led to the success of our guests. I'm Nate Svoboda, and I'm about to serve you up the best. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to this episode of E-commerce with Coffee. Today, we're chatting with Vance Reavie. He's the founder and CEO of Junction AI. And today, we're going to be geeking out a lot about AI, data, and why they matter, but ultimately focusing on how small to mid-sized brands should be evaluating tools before the competition ultimately beats them to it. So, Vance, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks very much, Nate. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm excited to start geeking out over data, AI, and all things technical. And you and I have had a lot of good talks in this space already, so I'm sure we're going to have a lot of fun.
No, absolutely. And before we get started, are you a coffee guy? I know you're high energy, so I don't know. Does caffeine play much of a role in your life?
Oh, it plays a huge role in my life. I'm so bad that I actually travel with my own little plunge pot and my own coffee, no matter where I go. Like that's critical in my carry-on. Everything else, I don't need it.
So what's your go-to then?
My go-to would be a coffee from the Pawes region in Costa Rica. I love the earthy flavor and a little bit of fruity flavor to it. And when it's cold, it's just beautiful.
So do you brew it cold or do you do pour over? How do you like to make it?
I do a plunge or a pour over, and then if I'm, I'll drink what I can in the morning, and then whatever's left over goes to the fridge, and that's perfect for my late afternoon shot.
Awesome.
Gotta keep that energy up, right?
Well, I got this cool thing recently that you can put a hot liquid into, you swish it around for a minute, and then it hyper freezes it. So I'll have to show you something kind of cool about something I discovered recently. Very cool.
I need to see that. I totally need to see that, and it might have to find a spot in my little carry-on for that now too.
Yeah, I am addicted to Amazon. That's definitely a problem. But anyways,
well, that's a great segue into what we're going to talk about, isn't it?
Exactly. Well, Vance, let's start at a high level look at the industry first, right? When people start throwing around terms like AI and data science and data connectors and things like that, right? What are we really talking about? How has this tech become relevant in e-commerce on an individual business level?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of big terminology used, and it reflects the fact that it is a big sector and it's a big industry and it's a big job. And there's so much complication and so many pieces of the puzzle, when you consider what makes everything work behind what we take for granted every day, jumping on someone's, online shop on their own website or a marketplace like Amazon or something like that. I mean, it's very easy as a consumer to engage in these things. And even the vendor tools are pretty easy to use in most cases, or at least some cases. But behind the scenes, it's really complicated. There's a lot of data being collected. It's got to be moved around. There's privacy data, there's financial data, there's just regular data. There's some data relevant to the merchant. There's some data relevant to the host. That data has to move somewhere. It has to be stored somewhere. It has to be sorted. It has to then be created into the analytics that we all use on countless dashboards these days. So we are talking about a pretty complex area. But that said, when we talk about the people who need to use the data, the product marketer or the person doing the analysis for e-commerce listings, they shouldn't be burdened by that. And that's sort of where I really come into this and get really passionate.
So in that sense, it's the person who's actually using the data, but then the people who are taking this raw data and actually making it into a format that's usable for making business decisions. Now, so exactly. Help me understand. So it seems like, let's say maybe the past 10 years, just for an easy number, that's really when tools have been proliferating, right? The barriers to adoption have seemed to kind of gone down significantly. Do you agree with that? Is that something that kind of you've been experiencing? Open that up to you. How has the barrier to adoption gotten to the point where pretty much any business can leverage the tech?
That's spot on. The barriers to adoption have dropped dramatically. And some of that is the cost, the infrastructure costing now for processing all this data and storing all this data has really become, ridiculously cheap compared to what it used to be, and a lot more self-serve and easy. So that's been one of the major instigators. Another big one, of course, is the fact that e-commerce has just grown to that extent that there's that much, not just e-commerce, but social media and all these online channels, it's dramatically increased the volume of data that's being collected because it is so cheap now to store that data. And then, of course, image sensors becoming so cheap that they're in absolutely everything, every phone is a camera, the volume of image and data being put up through video or image or whatever it is huge as well. But again, it's cheap to produce and it's quite cheap to store now. So we've got this sort of kind of a tie-in of different factors that allow us now to say, like, all kinds of SaaS providers who specialize in metrics maybe around video completion rate or views or budget management, they've been able to pull on that capability of lots of image sensors, cheap processing, cheap hosting, and volumes of data, huge volumes of data, so that they can deliver really specific tools that a marketer could use, or an analyst could use, or a product manager could use.
What would you say are like the most impacted areas of the business by AI up to this point?
A lot of the impact has been in the finance area and the back-end processing or operations, supply chain predictions on that sort of area. Marketing is certainly an area that's, involves AI. It probably has the biggest opportunity because marketing probably produces more data now than any other any other part organization. And I think some of the stats show that marketing is actually the biggest driver of IT spend now. So from an exciting, from an opportunity point of view, really marketing is sort of sitting right at the center of being the most relevant in terms of generating that data. That's the consumers they interact with. Marketing's there to interact with the consumers and get them to take those buy decisions or whatever it is we're trying to get them to do. We're generating that data on a mass scale. So it's a really exciting moment now that the marketers can take advantage of that and drive that to get a business advantage. But adoption rates have been a little bit lower in some areas just because it's difficult. The marketing team, there's an IT team, a marketing team, or there's outsourced vendors and that. So, it takes some time and effort to get there. The other thing I think that's been, kind of tricky in this space is the data we deal with in marketing is not the same as what other areas of the business deal with. And if, I'll use finance again, they're using numbers, budgets, and that's data is, pretty readily available. It's pretty well organized. The quality of the data is usually pretty clean. It's what we call structured data. And there's a lot of really good tools out there that use AI and some that don't, that, serve a great purpose on that data. But in marketing, we're working with much, much messier data. And, that's what makes it fun, of course, but it also makes it really challenging. I mean, you've got videos on YouTube and TikTok and all kinds of crazy things happening in a video. You've got images on Facebook and Instagram, stories on Instagram. Vast amount of data that's being created by both users and brands that are causing that interaction. And that data is really tricky to work with and voluminous, and there's a lot more to it. So that's slowed the adoption a little bit in marketing too.
So a very specific question, but something I've always just kind of been curious about. When a tool is looking at a photo, what is it really looking at about that photo at this day and age? Like, how developed is the technology in that respect?
Yeah, that's a really good one. And I think there's a lot of myths about AI and the power of AI. And I actually have this slide when I give presentations that, AI solved world peace, and I spell peace wrong on purpose because, I need to take down the tone a little bit. We see a lot of this around, self-driving cars and all that. And what people have to realize, there's quite a lot of different types of AI, but ultimately AI is trained by a human or trained in some way like that. And, driving around for millions of hours is training in AI. So when we look at images in that, what we're doing with it is we're looking for a pattern that seems to represent, what it's learned that pattern should be. So a table, all right, it's, a long plane surface that's usually horizontal. It might or might not have legs. So we're looking for those shapes, a rabbit, all these identifiable shapes. And, even through programs like reCAPTCHA and that, when you have to select the boats on the thing for the security question or select stop signs or whatever it is, right? And sometimes the pictures are grainy as can be. All of that is about training an AI to recognize what's what we call a concept in an image, or what they call labeling all the elements in the image. So you'd label a tree and you'd know it's a palm tree because of the leaf shape. You'd see a flower. Well, you'd probably know it's, whatever it is, or a t-shirt or an e-scooter, it's really about labeling everything in that image. So then as from a data perspective, once you have everything labeled and you know what everything is, and you're given, good programs, you're given sort of a stat that says how likely it is to be that, it's 99% sure it's a table, but it's maybe 85% sure that that's a vase with roses or whatever, right? But once you have all that stripped out of the image and all that data out of the image, then you can start looking at that data and saying, all right, well, one, was I on brand thinking that I was selling the t-shirts, but geez, it's not actually the most prominent thing in the photo. It's the scooter and the party balloons that are more prominent. So I might be confusing my audience. Or we can take that data like what we do, and we put that through an AI model to figure out then, what was it in the image that actually made the consumer take the action we wanted them to take, the click, the buy, whatever it is. When we look at the patterns across a lot of images to say, okay, well, when you put whole fruit in there instead of a slice of fruit, now we're getting we're getting more of a reaction from the consumers, and we've pinpointed it down to be that whole fruit. So to end the story, and it's a long one, I know, what we're saying here is, yes, a human could go look at thousands of these images and then start to make these hypotheses and test them. What an AI, in our case, our ML allows us to do is, AI ML is a perfect job for saying, let's look at those thousands or tens of thousands of photos in, a fraction of a second, strip that data off and capture that piece of information. We need whole watermelons or whatever it is. And it can do it in a second, unlike a human who would take hundreds of hours to do it.
That's my favorite part about machine learning is it just gets smarter over time, right? The more data you feed into it, the smarter it's going to get because it's training the algorithms. And there have been a lot of, and we'll talk a little bit about, data ethics and concerns and stuff to a point in, later in the conversation. But, there have been issues in the past where faulty models or models that are problematic have been fed in and trained, and, problems arise. People don't get a job offer, don't get interviewed, or something happens. I really, really would love, because you hit on it already, talk a little bit about Junction AI, your team. You guys do a lot of different nuanced, really cool stuff with AI. So if you could just give us an overview of kind of what's going on and what your teams do.
Yeah, well, we're really excited about what the opportunity we have. I mean, like I said, marketing's got the data, and they really, that consumer now is everything. It's front and center to everybody's business. And, we've had to change business so much over the last couple of years, especially. So for us, this is a really exciting moment because the data's there, and everybody wants to make a data-driven decision these days. I mean, it's just, everyone starts with that almost at the beginning. All right, great. And most companies have vast assets of data now. There's not a lack of data. There's actually probably too much data, and it's figuring out what data to use. So my team's benefit there, and what my team do is we love engineering. We love building things. So we built this platform that allows us to take in this wildly disparate amount of data, crunch it into something that's usable by an AI ML model it for a purpose. And what we call is that, it's our best performers model. And that really just teases those things, like I was saying, like what is it in the image, the colors, the demographics, the products in the images, what's in the copy, comparing against competitors, lookalikes, or other successes in the marketplace, comparing what failed in the marketplace and with that, so that we can then tease out the insights. So a marketer can just, log on and basically in a click do data science without having to worry about Python and coding it in their data sets and all that. They can actually do the work that they're supposed to do, which is take these insights and make great decisions for their business about new markets to attract, or improving their listings, or, forming a new strategy, whatever it is. But they don't have to do the other 80% of the work, which is figuring out how to harness that data, how to clean it up, what AI models they should be using. Did the models make sense? How do we tune the model? That's what we love doing. So my team are kind of probably the biggest group of geeks you're ever going to meet.
Well, no, I love that. And, I'm glad you made that last point. When an organization or a business starts working with different AI tools or with teams like Junction, what skills do they still need to have internally to be able to rely on, to be able to leverage these tools to the fullest capability? And I know that can vary depending on the tool or the business function, but.
Yeah, you probably hit on the most important thing that everybody needs to be thinking about or considering. And that's where the human adds value, like the most important thing they're doing in their job today. And I think that's where a lot of the scare factor has been about, AI is taking our jobs and things like that. And I mean, I'm not going to say there won't be cases of that, but it really is about shifting what the human workforce is doing. I think, management and leaders in companies and brands and need to be looking at how their teams are trained to use the insights that are derived from data, how to apply them, the structures around their approvals and their workflow processes, the processes that, that are causing friction so that they can't use their data or harness their data, or, take these insights and actually put them into action. Then how to what we call unpacking an insight. When an AI ML system like ours delivers out an insight, it doesn't just mean, oh yeah, it wrote a title or something, or it gave me these words, just go use them no matter what. The human job is judgment. I mean, AI is really crunching the data for us and giving us these insights, but the human value add job is using judgment. And so that's figuring out how to apply these insights in the best way for your business. And so that's, there's training needed there. And then the next part is then saying, well, do our workflows or do our internal processes still need to look the way they do, given we now have this tool that can crunch this data, give us insights really quickly, allows us to act more quickly than we did in the past. How do we make sure that we can go do that, test those out, learn from it, and then quickly reapply those learnings to our data, to our AI modeling, whatever it is, to tune it, to then get a little smarter along the way, a little smarter along the way. It's really, it's a journey, not a destination thing. So those are some of the influences and the changes I think we're going to see, and especially our area in the marketing space and, over the next few years.
No, and it's interesting. I like the point that you just made. I had a conversation recently with an individual who runs similar to an agency. It's different than the traditional model, but he made a point that a lot of times when a business starts working with an agency, they kind of have a almost adversarial or contentious relationship, right? The business, if the business realizes the agency missed something, they'll just wait and test the agency to see if they catch it rather than partner and work with them and try to collaborate on fixing the issue. So seems like there's a lot of instances with tools where, maybe it's not doing something 100% accurately, but it's meant to augment the person's work, right? Like what else value add can you get done in a day because of all the time saved from working with the AI, right?
You've nailed it on 2 points there. One is that augmentation. And we always say, like, you need to hire a data analyst or a data scientist. Your brand, you need your first one, and you need maybe a couple. Well, good luck finding them right now. And you're going to pay probably $150 after, everything in. That's huge. And that's still one human. They're still limited by those hours a day and all the other things that come with that. Well, wouldn't you like to maybe 10x your staff by changing that dynamic and saying, let the AI ML do all the work on its own, let the platform take care of that work. Let's just focus the human intelligence on that data analyst on actually building intelligence out of those insights that can be applied to the business. The second part that you really nailed it there is that accountability factor. And we see this an awful lot. And I think it's actually a really healthy thing to have happen, to start exposing more what's happening in the data. Because it can help influence decisions and it can help influence those relationships. And when you're talking agency and brand in particular, we have a case where, the agency, they want to use the data because they want to show the brand that they are making really good recommendations, that these aren't just, pulled out of thin air, guesswork sort of stuff. This is real data-driven work they're doing. And the brand, they want to know that the agency is giving them the right advice. They're always, like you said, that little bit of skepticism. Are they just selling us stuff? But they want the data as well to say, like, actually, this is proving what we thought was right or we thought was wrong, or the agency said was right or the agency said was wrong. So it kind of can create a nice, open, transparent relationship when you bring it down to the data. And then the personalities, or my gut says blue, that kind of disappears. You can take that out of it.
Yeah. I guess before we move on, this is a very open-ended question, but what are, if an organization is going to begin, leveraging an AI tool, right? Obviously, that means an immense amount of data is probably involved. So what are some of the potential ethical concerns or political concerns or, anything that a business or a brand owner should be thinking about, right? Obviously, the scale can be varied greatly depending on the business or whatever. But I guess I'll open that up. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, there's two things in there. One, I'm going to talk about the data side first, because I think we've come to the point where everyone knows we need lots of data. We need big data, and that's not always the case. What we're seeing now more and more is the ability to use what we call curating our data, and we do a lot of this work to curate the data down to the right data to use. Because that way you can understand you have a better likelihood of getting insights that are going to be useful. And that curation process can often mean that you're sort of almost looking at a minimal viable amount of data into these situations. But that might be the best way to start, because you might be polluting your insights with too much data. It might be apples, oranges, and bananas in there. And as a result, you're going to get insights that seem weird or ridiculous. And a lot of AI projects fail because exactly that. They don't have good curated data. So that's one of the myths I like to dispel a little bit about this need to think that you've got to be vast data like an Amazon would have to get any value out of it. It's actually understanding, what data you need. And the counterpart to that, or the partner to knowing that, is understanding your use case. What is what you really need it to do? Not a generic sort of overall, I need to boost revenue. All right, but actually let's break that down into what does that mean? How, what are the specific where are the specific problem points or pain points along that, or the challenges you're trying to overcome, that can then say, all right, now we have a really tightly defined use case. Excellent. Now that we know that use case, Perfect. We can say what data is most likely to have an impact on that. So there we've just limited that pool of data that we need to bring in, and we probably limited our costs quite dramatically too. And we've also limited what tools we're going to look at. We're not looking at, generic overall, got to build the world sort of data tools. We're actually looking at a tool that says, what's my video, completion rate? And if I change this, do I predict this, into a narrow slice? Good. Now I can just look at a couple vendors that specialize in that area, and the likelihood is you're going to find some that are cheap, some that are expensive, but you can squeeze into one of those, or at least find something to get started and to learn and get going, iterate on, and go, all right, now we've learned that it did work or it didn't work, it had this impacts. We know we need this additional data to get maybe a better result, or we need to change to another tool that can take us a little further. But yeah, I guess where I'm going is that, you've got to keep it really iterative like that, and start small, narrow that use case down, narrow the data you need down, and then build up from there, as opposed to starting big with all the data you could ever imagine and then spending months trying to figure out what the heck made any difference in that data.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting changes that has occurred in the past decade is how many businesses are able to operate and provide a service, whereas in the past there were best of breed solutions, right? There was always the phrase that you're not going to get fired for buying IBM or whatever the actual phraseology was. But it's interesting, to your point, that now people can go with a smaller solution that might fit their specific need, and that's 100% fine. But that said, given the vast number of solutions and tools out there, there's probably some fluff, right? Some that's more valuable than others. How would you advise a brand to tell the difference when they're making an evaluation?
Yeah, and I mean, this is a really good one, and it can be a little tricky because AI ML especially, it's a hype in the market. And we've seen, that's why I use my AI solves world peace slide, because the promise has been huge and everybody promises it and it's going to solve all our problems and blah, blah, blah. Well, we have to put that aside, because that's just definitely not the case. So yeah, it's a really, I think this is a really tough point, especially for the marketing community, because they're not traditionally part of the IT community, who can go interrogate these and dig below the surface and see these sorts of things. But I think from the marketing community, we do have enough technical experience. We're in charge of the data for the most part, that we do have the resources to make better decisions on our technology purchases. And I think we do that through really being clear about our use case and managing that use case. Like, it's very easy to, we need a bit of this and we need a bit of this, and can we do this as well? And we get a lot of that in our sector, and we have to react to things happening so quickly, something changing, a sale, competitors doing something, that it's really easy to keep piling on changes, or can it do this as well? But we have to think of what was the original pain point we were trying to solve? Did this tool solve that pain point? Did it automate my budgeting on my Google Ads? All right, if it solved that pain point, great. Don't get it to do other things. Don't expect it to, serve another purpose. Find another tool for that other purpose. And if you're at the size where you just don't want to have all those tools, then you can talk about a custom solution, or, a service provider that can then go across those various tools, the jobs those various tools did, and, make something different, or make something that's more unified or omni-channel. But it all comes down to understanding your problem and making sure that that's the problem you're actually solving with that tool, and not judging it by a bunch of other, criteria that you're not going to satisfy. And, we see that quite often in RFPs or requests from agencies or brands. It's soup to nuts, and the volume of things that this miracle tool is going to solve is just too big. It's too much. It's something for everybody. So therefore it's not good for anyone. So yeah, it's got to be narrowed down to a purpose.
And this is hard to answer. I can say that up front because of the fact that, again, it all depends on the business function that it's being applied to and the size of the business. But, if we're talking about the small to mid-sized brand, right, what type of ROI or return should they reasonably expect to get from leveraging an AI solution, right? So that they go into it setting proper expectations for themselves.
So this is an interesting one, because these businesses are typically, their profile is that they're got too much on, they're wearing too many hats, they're individuals in the company, or they're the marketer, they're also managing supply, they're also managing whatever. They've got so many jobs that they're doing that often they don't have what the big brands do, which is to have specialists to do each of these roles. The opposite, though, the converse of that, is that there's actually an enormous opportunity for the smaller brands or the mid brands to improve more dramatically, because they don't have a specialist. because they don't have a team of analysts or a business intelligence unit or a specialist group of marketers who just focus on optimizing Amazon listings. And that's what they do every single day. They have the ability, because there's more low-hanging fruit, because they haven't got those specialists sitting around who have sat there and done that craft and done that work every day to make it that good. So I often see that, we often see that there's more ability for them to show substantial gain. Now, that substantial gain, obviously, in a smaller business, it might be 10, 11 times improvement in their ad results or their listing, revenue or things like that on Amazon. That's huge. Whereas at a big brand, you'd be thrilled if you could get 2 or 3 times, because on those volumes, that would just be, insane amount of money. So one thing I like to look at is, where is it having material impact? Now, if you're a smaller brand or a mid-sized brand, probably something that can take away jobs that your team is already overburdened with or should be doing, but they never get time to. I'll use an example there. We worked with one company. The biggest thing for them was they were trying to monitor their competitors on Amazon to see what was changing on their listings. Did the price change? Did they change their title? Have they updated their images, their descriptions, all those sorts of things? You need that information if you're going to be really smart and beat them, right? But can you imagine just monitoring that every day or every second day and figuring out what changed on that listing and what words got changed? That's a huge amount of human work. So, all right, this is a job for an AI, something that can easily grab that data, look for a difference day by day, and if it's a significant difference, report it. Excellent. We have just saved that small business or medium-sized business, e-commerce manager, how many hours in her day or her team's day? And more often than not, when we hear them talk about this, they say, like, we know we should be doing this, but geez, we just don't get time. We might check once a month because that's all the time we have permitted. Wow. Well, okay. Now we're talking about something that a small business can really see a material impact. They can save all that amount of time and stuff that they should have been doing and wanted to do, and they can actually get it done because the AI is going to do it. So they're able to make better decisions and actually, do those decisions and make those changes and keep up to a bigger competitor.
So, obviously some tools are entirely dependent on a brand's own traffic or like data that's dependent on them. But if you have the opportunity to leverage a tool that the data doesn't necessarily matter what its source is, where can these smaller brands go to get larger data sets to either train the models or just have access to gain insight that's maybe applicable to a market more at large?
Yeah, and there's been so much change this last 2 years on data and third-party cookies being taken away, and that's really thrown everybody in the advertising side. That's really presented a lot of challenges, and I think you might have saw Facebook's results just this morning. They had a 20% stock plunge based on their ad business, showing a little complication in metaverse thing. So these sources of data, they're really important to a lot of these tools. We've had to start looking a lot more at first-party data, of course, on the advertising side, and that does affect e-commerce because you've got your first-party data, which is your audience. That's data you collected against people that have had an interaction with you. So that's great. That's a great audience, and there's always lots in that audience and low-hanging fruit in that audience. But what do you can't just stop there. You have to learn outside of your audience because you have to expand your audience at some point. Obviously, I hope so. If you want to grow your business. Yeah, and you want to learn from your competitors or what the industry benchmark is in your vertical. So that's third-party data. You're going to need something to learn from the outside because you're going to want to do both. You're going to learn from your own audience how to do, treat them better, sell more to them, keep them loyal, and then how are you going to get new audience and how are you going to fill in the top of the funnel? Where are you going to find the next opportunities for your business? And so that's a different data set. You're going to need probably some third-party data, which is, maybe it's benchmark data like, what's being searched on Google or Amazon for products, maybe what's selling most, who's the best sellers, all that sort of stuff. In advertising, it's a little more difficult for the third-party data because of the changes on cookies. But, there are different ways you can use to scrape data on social sites and things like that to get these data sources. Then of course, a business can buy data sources as well. There are a lot of services out there where you can buy sources from, looking at things like demographics and location-based data and, consumer preferences and things like that. But that can get expensive, especially for a small business. So we kind of have a process. We like to look at them to go through, and again, it starts with that use case. What's the problem they're trying to solve? But all right, what's your first party data telling you? What do you already have in stock right there between your social, your ad, your e-commerce data, your website analytics, anything like that? Like, what do you got there now that we can learn from? Because that's your low hanging fruit. That's your baseline. All right, now that we understand that, let's start thinking about the rest of the market. What are your competitors or brands that you think you look alike or wish you looked alike? What are they doing? What can we learn? What public data is available there? Maybe it's an influencer. Maybe it's some blogs that you're following. All right, can we take the data off that blog, find out what's, the critical points in it, compare it to 10 or 15 others or 100 others or 10,000 others, doesn't matter. Now let's start aggregating that into some insights that then can give you some direction on what to write about, what to include in your descriptions, whether you should use numbers or not use numbers in headlines, things like that. Best practices.
And I love that you hit on the competition piece, because this is, it's almost like exactly where I'm about to go. The competition today is moving faster and faster and faster, right? And part of it's because of the proliferation in tools. But there's a lot of companies that are laggards, right? They don't want to be a first mover, and they want to see what happens. But would love if you could just make the case for why should a business not wait to move on AI because of what their competition may or may not do.
Yeah, there's a real interesting discussion in that, because once someone's proven it, then it's a safe space. It's a lower risk to move into that space, and you may not be the first mover, the second mover, but probably the scraps coming off the table are more than sufficient for a lot of businesses, I think. So that's a safe spot to be. But I think the most important thing is that as a mentioning, the use of an AI tool is not a destination, it's a journey, and those gains compound over time, because the more you start learning from your data, the more the tools you use are run, the more your team has adopted them and trained up in using those insights or changing their internal processes to be more efficient. That's a compounding growth strategy, and that is going to deliver an outsized growth year after year compared to brands who aren't using that. So, if you get 2% behind your main competitor this year, by next year it's 3.5%, by next year it's 5%, or whatever the compound is on that, suddenly you're getting to the point where you're not going to catch up. And someone else will, because they're going to use these tools to stay more level to that industry leader, or maybe even leapfrog the industry leader, because they're getting the smarts ahead of them. Does that mean there'll be a few times it's not going to hit? You're going to have a few fails, maybe? Of course it is. That's just normal in marketing, and that's normal in advertising and e-commerce and product, engineering and all that. But what the AI, what the insights are really doing is helping you be smarter, so you have two of those misses so that you have successes. And that's where the growth strategy from more success, more targeting, better results, they all build on each other. So the more you know about your audience, the more you know about your competitor's audience, the better you can zero in on stealing that audience or appealing to them, or making sure you retain yours and they don't find the competitor sexier than you, and off they go.
Yeah, it's I forget where I heard this. It may be a famous phrase that I'm just not giving the credit to the person who initially said it, but those who succeed take risks, those who don't. Sounds like it applies.
This right there, it's easy.
Vance, this has been a very, very, very interesting conversation, but the last thing that I want to hear your thoughts on: what trends coming up in the next 3 to 5 years, either in AI, in data science and ML, and just tech in general? What are you most excited about in terms of what's going to impact the market?
I think there's a few things in there that I get excited about all this. I'm just hopeless for this. I don't sleep. I barely sleep because I'm so excited about this all the time. I've got data in my head all the time and the latest model research or whatever it is. But I think there's a couple key trends happening right now. One of them is addressing what you talked to right at the very beginning, is that the potential for bias and getting explainability and interpretability into this. And that's really important, because in marketers or product marketers or advertisers or any people in these space, we have to be able to explain these insights, and that's part of that unpacking. All right, so that's really important to understand how we do that. And I think the black box behind the Wizard of Oz's curtains or whatever that sort of approaches, and these are insights and the AI is smart and it should know. Well, no, we've got to be able to break that down and say, why did we get this? What was the logic behind that model? What was the logic behind the data curation we did? And then we can start looking at we probably introduced a bias into, or we've introduced, something that's we didn't want to see in the end. We have to be a little bit more educated about, what type of data we take in, and understand the impact that training data will have on the insights that we might get out of it. And we see that a lot now from people. They're wanting to look at their creative, or they're wanting to look at their data and look at diversity and diversity analysis. And that's not just sort of diversity wash over these things. They actually really want to know, like, are we hitting our targets, and are we showing ourselves to be a diverse company in our creative or in our copy? Is it aligned to that? Are people understanding that, we're making that effort? And so I think that's going to be one of the exciting areas, as we sort of have the more ability to sort of peer behind those curtains and poke and prod those models and understand that a bit better. The second part of that, I think they're really connected, is that sorry, I cut you off there.
No, I love that. Transparent AI. Totally on board.
Yeah, totally. Second part of that is we need to bring the people in that can do that analysis and have that ability. And a lot of that is the front-facing people of the business. And so the other big trend we're seeing right now is this move to no-code AI. So infrastructure providers, and I really feel that we do as an infrastructure, because it is essentially, so that the business user who's out there, in the intelligence group or the analytic group or whatever it is, or in the customer group or the marketing groups, whatever, they can actually use these tools and get results without having to code, without having to, take courses in Python and understand what modeling is, or, they shouldn't, that's not really their core use and their core best purpose. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest trends we'll see, is how these tools now become sort of, this capability to give an AI data scientist to everybody in your group, so that you could sit there right now and you could pull up some insights on something. And because it's, if you pair it with the first part of that, saying that you understand how data got in there, what to use, it was your data, or it was your Google data, or whatever it is, you can see, you could head off a problem in that bias issue or something right away, or you could, better interpret that data because you're in control and it's not just some IT black box.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love that you brought up the low code, no code platforms, right? I think this is maybe a minor example of it, but even in tools like HubSpot, where you can build an automated marketing sequence and it's just drag and dropping boxes onto a screen, and, take 10 minutes and try to figure it out. You don't need to know anything about coding. So I love that. That's been a super interesting trend, and it'll only continue.
That's spot on. And that is exactly the sort of tools that people in our sector need, because they have to react quickly or change quickly. Markets aren't, we don't have years to do these things. Like, things happen really fast in our markets. You have to experiment. You can have all these great AI predictions in the world, but the reality is there's a lot of experimentation still required. You want to make more intelligent experiments, but you want to be able to execute them quicker. So like you said, you could just, you could reorganize that process on HubSpot really quickly, and then go try it out and see, does it change your customer success rates, or, whatever it is you're trying to check on. But you can really quickly experiment on that without thinking, I got to do a project, I got to go hire coders, I got to go recruit some data engineers, I got to go recruit some developers, some DevOps people, I got to figure out my cloud hosting, UX, blah, 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 blah. It just goes on, and it becomes, oh my God, this is a huge project that's going to cost us a fortune. We'll shelve it and not bother. So, that's totally changing everything. And I think that's a great thing too, from the small, medium-sized businesses. That's an easy tool that they can get a result that's as professional and as high quality as the biggest brands out there. And they look as good, they react as good, they can be managed as well. They're collecting the same data as those big brands. So, that just levels the playing field. And I get really excited about stuff like that we can just totally level the playing field, that small brands doing experimental socks for running or whatever is just as good as, Nike out there in terms of how they can react, work with their customers, support them. That's fantastic stuff.
Almost never been a better time to be an entrepreneur, right?
Oh, you exactly got it. You're right.
Well, Vance, I don't think this will be our last conversation by any means, but in the meantime, where can our listeners get in touch with you or with the team at Junction AI?
You can go to www.junction.ai or just email me, vance.reavie@junction.ai.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us. Make sure you enjoy the nice tropical location that you're able to spend your time in right now. And have a great rest of your week.
Thanks very much, Nate. Great talking to you today. Looking forward to the next time.
Me too. That's it for this episode of E-commerce with Coffee, powered by Amber Engine. If you haven't gotten your fix yet, be sure to get more e-commerce brand secrets on our website at amberengine.com. And don't forget to subscribe for more episodes.